Please listen carefully.
Thank you all. How's everybody doing this afternoon? Yeah, I'm pumped to be here. I drove here all the way from DC. I always have to evoke my 3 children because they do give up time with their mother for me to go around and talk about an issue very passionate to me, which is neighborhood revitalization, community development. So, by a show of hands, how many people have actually checked out their genealogy? Right? You see those commercials, and those people always look super cool of how they could trace back their ancestors. So one evening, I guess I had some time between potty training and homework, and I actually decided to do one, and it was an amazing experience. And I learned, and so my father is an immigrant, so it's a little harder to do it, but my mother is native-born American, and so I was able to trace her ancestry back for at least 200 years here. And it was an amazing experience because I learned a lot about the choices of where my maternal family moved to, right? So I didn't have anything exciting in my genealogy, you know. I am, my people come from West Africa, like many African Americans. They settled after slavery. They were able to save some money. They were looking for a state that would allow black people to buy land. So they moved a lot around the South, and they settled on the eastern coast of North Carolina. And my people stayed there roughly for about 6 generations. And so what that made me realize is how important place is, and how people actually search and are shaped by the places in which they lived. So as I studied my genealogy, and I've been studying place for more than 2 decades. I'm a native New Yorker. I started out as a community organizer. Then I went to work in an established foundation. I'm a scholar. I have a PhD in sociology. I'll show you a little bit about that. I have studied place. I've worked with the Obama administration for the last few years, helping him implement place-based anti-poverty strategies. I currently work all over the country working on issues of vacancy and blight. I have worked with almost every population imagine, anybody that lives in a community I've worked with. And so studying my family's genealogy helped me really kind of place my own personal familial experience in context. And so what I learned about is the importance of place and how place structures who people are, both from a physical perspective and from a social perspective. Now, I know there's some determinists out there, and I absolutely agree with you. They're like, I am who I am. I would be who I am if I was born in North Dakota versus Florida versus California. And the truth is, yes, we all have individual identities that we're born in the world with. But place does fundamentally shape us. For instance, and I always make this joke because my mother's family is from the South, right? And I grew up in one of the most densest cities in the world, which is New York City. And I have learned when I go down south to always stop and say hello, right? To just take time and connect with people. Can you imagine 10 million people living in New York City if we would just stop and connect with each of them? You just can't do that. Density controls too much of your life. You're moving. You have somewhere to go. You have somewhere to go 10 minutes ago. You have to, and only when I'm not in that environment do I realize how, in some ways, broken I am around my human connection to people. But it does shape us, and I only use that as an exaggerated experience. Of course, I love New Yorkers. But I use that as an exaggerated experience to show that I have to actually slow down sometimes consciously to remember that it's important to connect with human beings. But there's also huge social aspects to where we live, right? And so how governments are shaped, how laws are implemented, mores, customs, they all impact who we are. And those in some parts are formed because of where we live. And it's a very interesting phenomena. But place also, as lovely as it is, and as it has formed all of us in this room, it forms us in great ways, but place also helps to reproduce inequality. Okay. So when I was working on my PhD, one of the books that I loved and fell in love with, and not in a great way, because it's not like a great book, but it's a book that really details American cities and how American cities help to reproduce inequality. They help to reproduce inequality. So reading and this book is pretty old, and but it is pretty old even for me. But what this book helps us realize is that people can be living in the same community but can be having totally different experiences. So when I think about this, I did my PhD in Chicago. So I moved to Chicago, South Side Chicago, and I lived there for 5 years, and man, did I realize that. There are people in Chicago that live in the north side of, any Chicagoans here? I just want to make sure, so I can be careful as I talk. There are people in Chicago that live on the north side that know nothing about the violence that we talk about on a daily basis that's happening in Chicago. They know about Chicago-style pizza, which I am a fan. They know about baseball. Right? I mean, the Cubs are a big deal, okay, on the north side. I mean, they know about Art Deco. They know about parks. They know about the lake. They know they know it, but from the way you and I know it by not living there. And then there are people in the south side of Chicago, and we're talking about people who live less than 2 miles apart, who are inundated with violence every single day. One thing that struck me when I lived in Chicago is how much vacancy there exists on the south side of Chicago, on the west side of Chicago. I grew up, like I said, in New York, where every piece of space is accounted for. When I moved to Chicago, there are like whole blocks that are just blown out. There's nobody there. And you cannot imagine real estate this important being less than 1 mile from the Chicago Mercantile, right? So it's amazing how people can live in the same environment but can be having totally different experiences. And I realized that I realized that where I grew up. I realized that in Chicago. And that has huge ramifications. Chicago, in a lot of ways, is the second most segregated city in America. The second. Anybody have any guess about the most segregated city in America? Milwaukee. It is the most segregated city in America. It is. And so this book helped me contextualize what that means. My parents, like I said, my mother grew up in the South. That's where her people settled. That's where they could buy land. And my mother, like many African Americans of the 1950s and 60s, moved to the North to find a better job. There was very little opportunity in the South for her. She moved to the North. She met a great guy, my dad. They got married. She finally got a government job. My father was an entrepreneur because he was an immigrant and could not get into the labor unions. The labor unions of the 70s were not allowing blacks to join them. So he had to work off the books. They wanted to buy a home. There weren't a lot of loan programs available for African Americans at the time. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm just using my own story to parallel how place shapes, but how place also reproduces inequality. So I'm going to pause the story there. And, this is an old leaflet from 1926 St. Louis. And they were, the government was really investing a lot of money in the development of suburbs during the late 20s, early 30s, and early 40s. Before World War II, everybody in America was pretty poor, except if you came from an elite family. And so that started to change with some government programming. And so this is just a leaflet showing some of the advertisements of wanting to attract white residents to a nearby suburb of St. Louis and save your home, vote for segregation. It was, we're going to talk a little bit about this. Oh, wait, let me go back. Oh, okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. So FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, right? What I've learned and what I really try to impart to people is that the federal government really has played an immense role in shaping our current kind of communities. And the other thing I like to share is that community development takes a long time. Okay? It takes a long time to change the trajectory of people's lives. So FHA, what they did for almost 30 years, and some people can argue a little longer, is they set up an elaborate grading system of how to evaluate whether or not to make investments in property. Like I said, in the early 19th century or 20th century, most Americans were poor. Unless somebody in here is a direct descendant of a Rockefeller or J.P. Morgan Chase, most Americans were poor. So how we started to create a middle class in America is through government intervention. FHA did an immense amount to help create a burgeoning middle class, the one that we're all trying to fight for today. And one way that they did that is through housing. And what FHA did was that they graded the property in almost every municipality in the country to see whether or not it was appropriate or worth investment. So if you got a D, a fourth grade, that usually meant you were redlined, right? So everybody in here, has anybody ever heard of the term redlined? Okay, so I'm preaching to the choir here. So that red line, I have a lot of hair, so I apologize for the noise. So that red line has huge consequences for who gets investment from the federal government. And if you got a green line, you got major investment. That usually meant cities were, areas of the cities were predominantly white, and they were good investments. So I'm gonna fast forward. So how many people here from Roanoke? Most people here from Roanoke. So I actually pulled a map of Roanoke, Virginia in 1937, and I wanted you to see the FHA drawings of the Roanoke map here. You may recognize the actual scale of the city, and you can begin to see the areas in red got very little investment from the federal government, and areas in green got the most. So I thought this was a very amazing map, but it was also indicative of what was happening in America at the time. And so in some ways, communities are segregated today, and it hardens me when we say, man, that's the way things always been. But it wasn't like that. People used to just live together because everybody was kind of poor. But when the federal government started to make investments in places and they rewarded segregation, that became the game of the day. Is how do we quarantine and segregate different populations of the city? So the other thing that struck me, and this was especially insidious, is racially restricted covenants. Anybody ever heard of that? So that they used to build this into people's actual deeds of ownership, where if you owned a home, it was actually written in your deed that you could not sell that home to anybody other than a non-white. It was their way, it was an economic development strategy to keep neighborhoods segregated, because neighborhoods that were segregated got more investment from FHA. And so if homeowners dared to actually break this or break their covenants, their racially restrictive covenants, there were huge consequences for them. Real estate agents that tried to go against this, they were blackballed. So this was a very, very serious thing. And it morphed, right? So this went on till 1968, right? And this is what I'm trying to say, that it takes a long time. It took a long time to get there. Oh, I think I lost it. It took a long time to actually get here. And it's going to take an equally long time to actually work ourselves out of it. And so for my own family, as I think about how they developed their own housing journey, had their own housing journey. In 1975, they attempted to buy their first home, because that's what couples do before they have kids, a lot of them. And at that time, it was very difficult for African Americans to get loans from banks. Very, very difficult. Even if they had the job, even if they had the savings, it was very, very difficult. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. And so, and what my parents did, or what happened right at the time where they were buying a home, was obviously the Fair Housing Act started in 1968 by Lyndon B. Johnson, was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And a few years after that, in 1972, we had the Community Reinvestment Act that was being enacted. And the Community Investment Act actually tracked where banks were giving, right? Where banks were lending their money. It tried to bust up redlining. And the Community Reinvestment Act also gave banks a score, and so banks could be evaluated based on where they were giving. So if we looked at a bank and we knew that they weren't giving to a low-income neighborhood, they would get a bad score, and that bad score would have huge consequences. So this was one of the first pieces of legislation that actually managed to actually be almost like a watchdog for banks. But because of CRA, what also happened was the birth of the Community Development Corporation field, right? All the CDCs, money, community development block grants, all that sort of parallel banking world that was created to help those who could not appropriately get financing in a mainstream America. It helped people like my parents, who worked hard, who saved money, who wanted to start a family, but before they did, they wanted to own a home, but could not get a loan from a traditional bank, because many African Americans at the time could not get loans. The Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation was the first organization in America to actually start loaning money to minority homeowners. It was what we call now a pilot by Lyndon B. Johnson. Okay, I just want to make sure I'm on time. So because of that, they were able to buy a home. So I know everybody in here is like, well, what does that mean, Akilah? Like, okay, we talked about history. We got it. You know, the federal government they had a dirty hand in this. You know, people of color, African Americans, and other people of color were not able to buy a home. So what do you want us to do in 2017 now? Well, we've had numerous conversations today about wealth. Housing still is one of the major ways that individuals generate wealth. And because of those housing policies of yesteryear, what we see is a huge wealth gap that we cannot explain based on education and employment. We cannot explain it based on education and employment. What we are seeing here are huge gaps in wealth. Wealth takes multiple generations to develop, at least 2. Unless you hit the lottery. But for most people, they have to work, they have to save, you make smart decisions, you bequeath the wealth you have to your children, they build upon it, they marry somebody, they pull their wealth together, it builds. So your grandchildren now are enjoying a certain level of lifestyle. That opportunity for people of color in this country just did not happen. Because of policy. And because of that, we're seeing a huge wealth gap. And so I don't have that much time left, but I do always love to give people a bit of context, because if not, what will happen is that we begin to blame people for why they're not in the position that they're in, why they don't have money, why people aren't wealthy, why you aren't middle class. That home that my parents bought in 1977 is their nest egg today. So if the Fair Housing Act wasn't created, if Community Reinvestment Act wasn't signed into law in 1972 by Richard Nixon, or Gerald Ford, okay. If a CDC wasn't created, if the CDC industry wasn't created, my parents wouldn't have been able to buy a home. And even when they wanted to sell that home and buy another home, because they wanted to grow their family, they couldn't even do that because real estate agents were steering them in particular communities. That's still the postscript. That's the 80s. And that has huge ramifications, again, for wealth. So what do you all do? Right? Because every time I talk to a committed group of individuals, I always want to give them a charge. And so in your lives, in your professions, it's important to promote affordable housing. Quality, fair, affordable housing. It matters. It matters. Housing is the number one expense that most families endure monthly. And so we need it to be quality, we need it to be accessible, and we need it to be affordable. Whether that is home ownership, whether that's rental. I ask all of you to push that doctrine. Second, it's about community engagement. That anytime you're doing work in communities, it's important for us to engage residents. They have a lived experience, they have skin in the game, and I think it's important for them to be at the table making decisions, along with other stakeholders. The other is taking a regional approach to how we do community development. Communities are embedded, right? So even though we are in Roanoke, Virginia, we are embedded in the state of Virginia. So what happens in the state of Virginia has huge ramifications for what happens right here. And so anytime you are working on or doing neighborhood revitalization work, it's important for you to understand context, regional economic context. It cannot happen in absence of. And last, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, is data. We have so much good quality data, and not just number data. So I am a quantitative researcher. I study huge data sets. But we also have the lived experience of people in communities. That's data too. We have to start using data to make really smart, strategic decisions about resources. And so that's, those are just kind of some of my thoughts for you all. And I appreciate your time. And, I want you all to continue to go out and push the mantra for responsible community development. Thank you.